I walked out to find my lake cabin demolished. A pile of splinters. The HOA did this for refusing to pay HOA fees for an association I wasn't even in. The president just smirked, handed me a notice and said, "This is what happens when you ignore us." This cabin was the last place I had left of my wife. They turned her memorial into trash. But while that woman was celebrating her victory, she had no idea about the one tiny detail she missed in the property records. A detail that meant I didn't just own my little cabin, I owned her entire neighborhood. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, because this revenge plan is one for the books. And if you believe a bully with a clipboard is no match for actual justice, hit subscribe. You do not want to miss her epic, on-camera meltdown. The first thing that hit me wasn't the sight, but the smell. Freshly cut pine and damp earth. It's a good smell, usually, but that morning, it smelled like a funeral. I stepped out onto my porch with a cup of coffee, ready to watch the morning mist burn off the lake, and the world just stopped. Where my cabin used to be, there was nothing. A pile of splintered 2x4s, mangled siding, and the green metal roof, twisted like a crushed beer can. A single beam, my wife Mary's favorite one that we'd carved our initials into, was sticking up from the rubble like a tombstone. For a moment, my brain refused to process it. I thought maybe I'd finally lost it. Maybe the grief had chewed a hole in my memory, and I'd forgotten tearing it down myself. But I hadn't. Standing beside the wreckage, next to a contractor wiping his hands on a rag, was Carla Pennington. She held a clipboard like a scepter, her floral print blouse perfectly pressed, a cold little smile playing on her lips. She was the self-appointed president of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association, an organization I'd never joined, never paid, and never wanted anything to do with. "We warned you, Walt," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Non-payment of dues. This is what happens when you ignore our notices." The contractor just looked at the ground, a man doing a job he clearly didn't want to be doing. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was full of concrete. That cabin, that was Mary's place. It's where she'd sit for hours watching the loons, a book in her lap. After she passed, it became the only place the silence didn't feel so loud. It was where I taught my grandson Leo how to cast a line off the little dock last summer. His first fish, a tiny little sunfish, he treated it like a trophy marlin. All those memories were now just to debris. Carla took a step forward and thrust a piece of paper at me. At the top, in aggressive red letters, it said, "Final notice of line and enforcement action." She walked off without another word. Her job done. Leaving me staring at a document that made no sense and the pile of wood that used to be my life. My peace, gone. Demolished, without a warning, without a single phone call. Just a quiet chainsaw in the early morning. Back in my house, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone. This had to be a mistake. A monstrous, bureaucratic screw-up. I called the county records office, my voice cracking as I gave the clerk my parcel number. I asked her, point blank, if my property was part of any registered homeowners association. She put me on hold for what felt like an eternity. I could hear her tapping on a keyboard, the faint clicks echoing in the silent house. Finally, she came back on the line. "No, sir," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Mr. Anders, your parcel, number 77B, has no HOA covenants attached. It never has. You're clear." A wave of relief washed over me, so strong my knees went weak. It was a mistake. A horrible one, but a mistake. I could fix this. I could show them the county records, and they'd have to answer for what they'd done. But just as I hung up the phone, a car pulled into my driveway. It was Carla's Lexus. She got out, looking even more smug than before, if that was possible. She must have seen me looking out the window, seen the hope on my face, and came back to stomp it out. "I heard you were making calls," she said, not even bothering to come to the door. She just yelled it from her car. Let me save you some time. We formed the Lakeside Meadows HOA 3 years ago, and we included your property in the master plan we filed. You were sent a notice. When you didn't contest it within the 30-day window, you automatically opted in. That's your problem, not ours. I stared at her, dumbfounded. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. She was admitting it was a sham, a land grab based on a piece of mail I'd probably thrown out as junk. She was counting on me being an old man, too tired or too confused to fight back against her clipboard and her made-up rules. In that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It wasn't just about the money or the mess. It was the predatory way she looked at me, like I was nothing more than an obstacle to be bulldozed. My trust in neighbors, in basic decency, in the idea that people wouldn't just rob you in broad daylight, it all evaporated. This wasn't a mistake. It was an attack. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just sat in the dark. The image of that rubble burned into my mind. I thought about Mary, and what she would have said. "Don't let them push you, Walt," she'd have said. "You're smarter than they are." Around 2 a.m., I got up, put on my old work boots, and walked out to the shed in the backyard. The air was cold and smelled of rain. Inside, it smelled of oil, sawdust, and time. I flicked on the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Pushing aside old toolboxes and stacks of electrical conduit, I knelt down and pulled out a battered metal footlocker. Inside was a folder, thick with age. I blew a layer of dust off the cover and opened it. There they were, old deeds going back to the 1950s, original plat maps of the entire area, and a military-grade topographical survey I'd commissioned 20 years ago for a drainage project. I spread the main plat map out on my workbench. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn document from a developer who went bust decades ago. As my finger traced the faint blue lines that marked the original property boundaries, the ones the county's digital maps never quite got right, I felt a grim smile form on my face. Carla thought this was her kingdom. She had no idea she was just a guest. "All right, Mary," I whispered to the empty shed. "If it's war she wants, it's war she'll get." The day after the demolition, I started walking. A map is a good start, but a war is won with intelligence, and that means boots on the ground. I went door to door, not as a victim, but as a neighbor, with a simple question: when did you join the HOA? The first door was opened by a woman named Sarah, a young mother who looked terrified just to be talking to me. She told me she'd gotten a fine for $200 because her son's tricycle was left on the lawn overnight. She paid it. She thought the HOA was legitimate. The next house was a guy my age, a retired mechanic named Bill. He was angrier. Carla's HOA had put a lien on his house because his fishing boat, parked on his own gravel driveway, was a foot too long, according to some rulebook nobody had ever seen. He was fighting it, but the legal fees were bleeding him dry. The story was the same at every house. People were confused, scared, and resentful. They'd all received complicated documents in the mail, full of dense language about covenants and bylaws. Most just signed them to avoid trouble. Carla had built her little kingdom on a foundation of fear and fine print. She'd slipped these documents in with tax notices and utility bills, counting on people not reading them. She had manufactured a phantom government, and it was working. I knew then that I couldn't fight this with anger. I needed precision. I called my oldest friend, Ray Alvarez. We'd served together in the Navy. He was a lawyer in the JAG Corps, a guy who could dismantle a 500-page contract with a red pen and a cup of lukewarm coffee. We called him Doc because he could diagnose the sickness in any legal argument. I laid it all out for him on his kitchen table, spreading out my old maps next to the phony lien from Carla. Doc listened, his face like stone, just nodding slowly. When I finished, he took a long sip of coffee. "So this woman," he said, his voice a low rumble, "invented an HOA, illegally absorbed your land into it, And then demolished your property for not paying fees to her make-believe club? I nodded. That about sums it up. Doc leaned back in his chair, and a slow, dangerous grin spread across his face. Walt, he said, this isn't a lawsuit. This is a pest control problem. 2 days later, a cease and desist letter, drafted by Doc and sent via certified mail, landed on Carla Pennington's doorstep. It was a beautiful piece of work, simple and direct. It stated that her HOA had no legal authority over my property, that the demolition was an act of criminal destruction, and that she was to have no further contact with me. For a few days, there was silence, a hopeful quiet. I thought maybe, just maybe, the threat of real legal action had scared her off. I should have known better. Bullies don't back down. They double down. I woke up one morning to find bright orange signs zip-tied to my fence. Community violation. They screamed in big block letters, "This property is not in compliance." It was a public shaming. Then came the call from the county inspector. An anonymous complaint had been filed about dangerous and unpermitted electrical work at my main house. It was a direct shot at me, at my career as an engineer. The inspector found nothing, of course, but that wasn't the point. The point was to harass me, to tie me up in knots. The final blow came that Friday evening. I was watching the news when the lights flickered and died. I went outside to check the breaker and saw him, Steve Morrow, Carla's lapdog, the wannabe cop who acted as her security officer. He was walking away from my junction box, a pair of wire cutters in his hand. He just shrugged at me. "HOA orders," he said. "Emergency action. Faulty wiring." My power had been cut, not by the utility company, but by a guy in a cheap security uniform. That was the last straw. The rage I felt was cold and clean. I walked back to the pile of rubble where my cabin used to be. The contractor had just bulldozed everything into one big heap. I had to know if anything at all, was salvageable. I spent the next hour carefully pulling apart splintered boards and twisted metal. And then, I found it. The small, heavy wooden box I kept on the mantelpiece. It was cracked down the middle, the lid broken off. And it was empty. That box had held Mary's ashes. We'd spread most of them over the lake, just like she'd wanted, but I'd kept a small portion, a final memory of her in her favorite place. I fell to my knees. The dirt, the wood splinters, the nails, it was all mixed together. They hadn't just destroyed a building. They had taken her from me all over again. They had shoveled up her ashes with the rest of the debris and dumped them like garbage. The fight was no longer about a cabin. It wasn't about money or property lines. It was about a line that had been crossed from which there was no return. I stood up, wiping the filth from my hands. My new strategy was simple. I wasn't just going to prove Carla Pennington was wrong. I was going to dismantle her entire world. I spent the next week at the county records office, not just looking at my own parcel, but at the entire history of the Lakeside Meadows development. I pulled dusty old plat books, scrolled through endless reels of microfiche, and cross-referenced every deed transfer since 1950. Carla had built her HOA on modern, inaccurate county overlays, but I was looking at the source code, and deep in a developer agreement from 40 years ago, I found it. A single clause, a forgotten failsafe. A detail so small and so old, no one had ever thought to look for it. It was the key. Carla thought she was the queen of this neighborhood. She had no idea she was just a tenant. It took me 4 days, hunched over a flickering fluorescent light in a dusty county basement. But I found it. It wasn't hidden, just old. Buried in a file labeled Lakeside Meadows Development, Trust, Dissolution Agreement, 1978. The original developer had structured the entire neighborhood as a private land trust. He sold the lots for the houses, but the trust itself retained ownership of all the common areas, the roads, the green spaces, even the little gravel path down to the public boat launch. Then, in the early 80s, the developer went bankrupt. The trust was dissolved. A small clause on page 17 written in faint typewriter ink, dictated what happened next. Upon dissolution, if the trust's assets weren't sold, ownership of all common lands would automatically default to a designated backup entity. And that's when my heart started pounding. 20 years ago, a small parcel on the far edge of the neighborhood went into foreclosure. I bought it as an investment through a small limited liability company I'd set up for legal protection, a standard practice. The company was called North Ridge Holdings LLC. I'd nearly forgotten about it, a dormant file in my cabinet. The name of the backup entity on that 1978 document? North Ridge Holdings LLC. The original developer had set up my little LLC as a placeholder backstop decades before I even owned it. He likely owned it himself, sold it off, and I'd bought the company, lock, stock, and land rights, without even knowing it. Carla had built her HOA on a digital map, a flimsy overlay from the county website. She'd never looked at the original paperwork. She assumed the roads were public, and the green spaces were undefined, community property ripe for the taking. She was wrong. Her entire kingdom, every road she drove on, every sign she posted, every inch of land her phantom HOA claimed to manage, it was all built on my property. While I was connecting these dots, Carla was tightening her grip. She was feeling bold after cutting my power. One morning, Bill, the retired mechanic, called me, absolutely furious. A tow truck was hauling away his fishing boat. The reason? It was parked in a designated HOA easement, his own driveway. The next day, more cars were towed. People were getting notices for having the wrong color mailbox, for grass that was a half-inch too high. She was waging a campaign of terror. Then came the envelope in my own mailbox. It wasn't a flimsy notice this time. It was a thick, professionally printed demand letter, a final violation notice and intent to foreclose. Inside was an itemized bill that was almost comical in its villainy. Demolition costs, administrative fees, retroactive dues, fines for my dangerous wiring, penalties for non-compliance. The grand total was $87,452. It was an extortion number, designed to make an old man's heart give out. A few days later, her crew was out again. This time they were hammering new signs into the ground at the entrance to the neighborhood and along the path to the lake. Big metal signs with crisp lettering. Private HOA property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. I watched from my window as she directed the workers, pointing with a smug satisfaction. She was planting her flag on my land. The weight of it all started to press down on me. The legal battle, the constant harassment, the looks from neighbors who were too scared to side with me. I started to wonder if Mary was right, if I was just an old fool picking a fight I couldn't win. That weekend, my daughter dropped off my grandson, Leo, for the afternoon. We usually went straight down to the lake, but he stopped at the edge of the woods and just stared at the pile of debris where the cabin used to be. He's only 7, but he's a sharp kid. He understands absence. He turned to me, his big brown eyes filled with a sad, genuine confusion that broke my heart clean in two. "Grandpa," he asked, his voice small, "why did that mean lady take Grandma's place away?" I didn't have an answer. I just knelt down and hugged him, my own eyes burning. The $87,000 notice was just paper. The signs were just metal. But this was the real cost of Carla's war. I saw the doubt in my own daughter's eyes when she picked him up. The unspoken question, "Is this fight worth it, Dad?" For the first time, I almost gave in. I thought about selling the house, moving away, and leaving this whole rotten mess behind. That night, I sat in my workshop, the foreclosure notice in one hand, ready to call it quits. But then my eyes fell on the drone map I had framed on the wall, a high-resolution aerial view of the entire neighborhood. I'd used it years ago to plan a new septic system. I looked at the roads, the houses, the power lines, the way everything was connected. I wasn't just seeing a neighborhood anymore. I was seeing a grid, a system, and a system can be controlled. A grim smile touched my lips for the first time in weeks. I stood up and walked over to the map, a black marker in my hand. It was time to stop reacting. It was time to flip the grid. The first move wasn't a cannon shot. It was the quiet scratch of a pen on paper. I took my entire file, the old deeds, the trust dissolution, the proof of my LLC's ownership, to a title agent Doc recommended. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, with eyes that could spot a fraudulent signature from across the room. We spent 2 days filing a series of quiet title actions and updating the official property registrations with the county. It was a purely administrative maneuver, a deed flip that shifted the ownership of all the common lands in Lakeside Meadows, from a long-dead, defunct trust to my very much alive Northridge Holdings LLC. It cost me a few $1,000s in legal and filing fees, a gamble that felt like betting my entire life savings on a single hand of poker. But it was the only move I had. With the paperwork filed and recorded, the board was set. Now I just needed to invite the queen to the game. I didn't want a confrontation at my front door. I needed an audience. I needed to dismantle her authority in front of the very people she terrorized. I used a simple mailing list I got from the county tax rolls and sent out a letter to every household. It was a plain, professionally printed invitation to a Lakeside Meadows community information session to be held at the local library's meeting room. I didn't put my name on it, just a generic, concerned residents group. Predictably, Carla couldn't stand the idea of a meeting she didn't control. 2 days after my letters went out, a new notice appeared, posted on the community bulletin board she'd installed. It was on her official-looking HOA letterhead. It announced a mandatory board meeting at the same time and place as my session, stating that the primary agenda item would be the final enforcement proceedings against resident Walter Anders for non-compliance. She was walking right into the trap. She thought she was hijacking my meeting. In reality, she was sending out the invitations to her own public execution. The library meeting room was packed. I'd guess nearly 50 people were there, a mix of worried-looking retirees, young families, and a few people who were clearly on Carla's side. Carla was set up at a long table at the front, flanked by her smirking enforcer, Steve, and a woman who served as her secretary. A stack of papers and her ever-present clipboard sat in front of her. She radiated an smug confidence, soaking in the authority she felt the room gave her. I didn't sit in the audience. Instead, I waited in the hallway with Doc and another old friend of mine, a retired city planner named Frank Miller. Frank was a guy who could make zoning regulations sound like common sense. At exactly 7 p.m., we walked in. We didn't take seats. We just walked up and stood to the side of the room, each of us holding a thin file folder. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as people saw me. Carla gave me a venomous look and banged a small gavel on the table. "This meeting of the Lakeside Meadows HOA is now in session," she announced. "First order of business? The property at 77 Lakeview Drive. Mr. Anders has refused to pay his dues and penalties, totaling over $87,000. That was my cue. I took 2 steps forward. "Carla, that's not what this meeting is about," she scoffed. "Excuse me? You don't get to speak unless recognized by the board, Walter." I ignored her and turned to the crowd. "My name is Walt Anders. I'm your neighbor. I called this meeting to share some information I found at the county records office." I gestured to Frank. "This is Frank Miller. He was the chief planner for this county for 30 years. Frank gave a polite nod. He unrolled a large laminated copy of the original 1978 developer's plat map and tacked it to a corkboard. It showed the entire neighborhood in clean, simple lines. "Folks," Frank began, his voice calm and steady, "I've reviewed the founding documents for this neighborhood. I've also reviewed the paperwork Mrs. Pennington used to establish her association." He pointed to Carla. "Based on that review, I can tell you 2 things for certain. First," he paused, letting the silence hang in the air, "this homeowners association doesn't legally exist." The room erupted in whispers. Carla's face went white, then red. That's a lie. A desperate ploy from a delinquent. We are registered with the state. Doc stepped forward. Being registered as a corporation doesn't give you jurisdiction, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 courtroom arguments. You have no covenants attached to these properties. You have no legal right to levy fines, file liens, or enforce a single rule. The whispers grew louder. Bill, the mechanic whose boat was towed, shouted, "So you're saying she took my boat illegally?" Before Doc could answer, Carla slammed her gavel again. "This is a ridiculous fantasy. This is private HOA property. You are all bound by the rules." That's when I stepped up to the map. I pointed to the roads, the greenbelt by the lake, the entrance. "Actually, Carla, it's not," I said, my voice perfectly level. Frank handed me a freshly printed deed. "This land isn't community property. It's private property." I held up the deed for everyone to see. And as of this morning, I own it. All of it. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Carla stared at the document, her mouth slightly open, the confident mask finally cracking. I let the moment sink in, then delivered the final blow. "And as the legal owner," I said, looking directly into her horrified eyes, "I am hereby revoking every single one of your HOA's easement and access rights to this property, effective immediately. Your signs are on my land. Your authority is a fantasy. And you, Mrs. Pennington, are trespassing." The meeting ended in chaos. Carla was left sputtering at the front of the room, her face a mask of disbelief, as people swarmed me, Doc, and Frank with questions. But talking was over. The time for action had arrived at dawn the next morning. A flatbed truck from a local fencing company rolled up to the entrance of Lakeside Meadows. I was there to meet them with a thermos of coffee and a copy of my freshly certified land survey. We weren't putting up a decorative picket fence. We were installing 8-foot-tall commercial-grade chain link, the kind you see around a power substation. We started at the main entrance, sinking the metal posts deep into the soil on my side of the property line. I had measured it all out with the precision of an engineer designing a circuit board. There was no room for error. By 9 a.m., Carla showed up, her Lexus skidding to a halt just outside the work zone. She jumped out, her face flushed with fury. Steve, her security goon, was right behind her, trying to look intimidating. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked. "You can't do this. This is community property." I just took a slow sip of coffee. "Morning, Carla," I said calmly. "No, it's not. This is private property. Mine, to be exact. I showed you the deed last night." She jabbed a finger at the fence posts. "I'll have you arrested for destruction of property. This is an HOA access road." I pulled a folded document from my back pocket and handed it to her. It was a copy of the easement revocation I had filed. "Not anymore, it isn't. You no longer have a legal right to be here." Steve stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "We'll be taking this down," he growled, reaching for one of the posts. I didn't even look at him. I just looked at the foreman of the fencing crew, a big guy named Mike. "Mike," I said, "this man is trespassing. If he touches your equipment, you should probably call the sheriff." Steve hesitated. He was good at bullying old ladies about their mailboxes, but facing a crew of guys who worked with their hands for a living, he deflated like a cheap balloon. He looked at Carla. She looked at the fence. Then she looked back at me, her eyes filled with pure, undiluted hatred. She got back in her car and sped off, tires spitting gravel. The fencing continued. We did leave a 4-foot gap for people to walk through. My fight wasn't with my neighbors, it was with her. Phase 2 started that afternoon. I called in a few old friends, guys I'd served with in the Navy, who had started their own electrical contracting business after they retired. They understood grids better than anyone I knew. Carla's HOA ran a few non-essential systems through junction boxes located on the greenbelt, the land I now owned. Sprinklers for the flower beds at the entrance, ornamental lighting on her big Lakeside Meadows HOA signs, and the power to her little security shack. It was all routed through easements I had just legally revoked. My friends worked with professional speed. They didn't just cut the wires, they performed a proper lockout-tagout, following every safety procedure. They opened the boxes, disconnected the circuits, and placed heavy-duty locks on them with bright red tags that read, "Danger, do not operate." Within an hour, every light on her signs was dead. Every sprinkler head was dry. Her little empire was going dark. This time, she didn't come herself. This time, she sent the police. 2 county sheriff's deputies rolled up around 3 p.m., responding to a call about a local terrorist destroying community property and illegally blocking public roads. My heart pounded, but I kept my cool. This was the moment of truth. One of the deputies, a young, serious-looking man, got out of his car. "Sir, we've had a complaint that you're blocking the road and cutting power." I had a folder ready for him. "Officer, my name is Walt Anders. This road is not public. It is private property, and I am the owner. Here is the certified deed recorded with the county yesterday." I handed him the document. "We've also had a report about cutting power lines." I nodded. "Yes, sir. My crew and I disconnected non-essential power lines from junction boxes located on my property. The HOA's easement to operate those lines was legally revoked this morning. Here's a copy of that filing." I gave him the second document. He took the folder and spent a good 5 minutes reading, his partner looking over his shoulder. He walked back to his patrol car and spoke on the radio. Carla had apparently driven to the other side of our new fence and was waiting. The deputy walked over to her. I couldn't hear what was said, but I could see it. Her frantic gesturing, her indignant pointing, the officer's calm, patient head shaking. After a few minutes, he walked back over to me and handed me my folder. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Anders," he said. "This is a civil matter. As far as we're concerned, this is your property. Have a good day." He turned to Carla and said, loud enough for me to hear, "Ma'am, at this point, if you remain on this side of the property line, you are the one trespassing." That evening, I typed up a letter. I printed a copy for every single house in the neighborhood and walked street by street, putting one in every mailbox myself. The letter was simple. It explained that I was the legal owner of the roads. It explained that Carla's HOA was not and had never been a legitimate legal entity with any authority. It stated in plain English, "You are free to live here. You are not required to pay Carla another dime. You were never part of her HOA." At the end, I made a proposal to form a new, voluntary neighborhood council with open votes, transparent finances, and no mandatory dues to manage any real community issues that might arise. My phone started ringing an hour later. It was Bill, the mechanic. He was almost shouting with joy. Then Sarah, the young mother, called, her voice full of relief. By 10 o'clock, I'd heard from a dozen families. The tide was turning. Carla had lost her fences. She had lost her power. And now, she was starting to lose her people. Her spiral had begun. Carla's last stand was desperate. She called an emergency HOA board meeting at the same library, plastering notices that promised to reveal the truth about the hostile takeover of our community by a delinquent resident. It was pure theater, a final attempt to rally her shrinking base of supporters and paint me as the villain. I knew she'd do this. I also knew it was the perfect place to end it. I wasn't the only one who saw an opportunity. The day before the meeting, I got a call from a young woman named Tina Lambert. Her father was one of my neighbors, a quiet guy I'd spoken to earlier. Tina, however, was not quiet. She ran a local news and commentary channel on TikTok, known for exposing petty corruption and holding local officials' feet to the fire. "Mr. Anders," she said, her voice crackling with energy, "my dad told me everything. This woman is a textbook case of a petty tyrant. My followers would love this. Would you mind if I came to the meeting and documented it?" She'd asked for permission, which I appreciated. As long as you just show what happens, I told her. That was all I needed. The truth, in high definition. The room was even more tense than before. Carla's remaining loyalists sat in the front rows, arms crossed, glaring at the rest of us who had come to watch the final act. Tina was already there, sitting in the back corner, her phone propped up on a tiny tripod, looking like she was just texting a friend. A small red light indicated she was live. Carla, flanked by Steve and her secretary, banged the gavel. "This emergency session is called to order," she began, her voice tight with rage. "We are here to discuss a clear and present threat to our property values and our safety. Walt Anders has engaged in a campaign of intimidation and illegal obstruction." She went on for 5 minutes. A tirade of lies and accusations, painting herself as the victim, protecting a peaceful community from a dangerous anarchist. She tried to assert her old control, but the magic was gone. The room was no longer afraid of her. They just watched, waiting. When she finally paused for breath, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I wasn't carrying a map this time, just a small digital audio recorder. "Carla," I said quietly, "you talk a lot about rules. Let's talk about the rule you broke to start all this." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." I pressed a button on the recorder. A woman's voice, nervous but clear, filled the room. I told her, I said, "Carla, we can't just add Mr. Anders' property to the HOA rolls. He's not part of the original plat." And she just laughed. She said, "Don't worry about it. I'll just sign his name myself." Old men like that never check their mail anyway. The voice belonged to Carla's former HOA treasurer, a woman who had resigned a month ago after realizing the entire operation was a fraud. She had called me, racked with guilt, and agreed to let me record her statement. The room was silent. Every eye was on Carla, whose face had gone pale. That's a doctored recording. A fabrication," she stammered. I didn't respond. I just turned to the projector Tina had helped me set up earlier. "Let's talk about the demolition," I said, and clicked a button on my laptop. The screen lit up with a crystal-clear aerial view, taken from my drone. It showed my cabin intact. The date and timestamp were in the corner. Then, the video played. A contractor's truck pulling up. 2 men getting out with chainsaws. No permits posted. No safety cones. No debris shields. The video, sped up, showed them tearing into the structure, board by board, until it was nothing but a pile of ruin. As the roof finally collapsed, I froze the frame. "According to county law," I said, my voice cold, "a demolition permit is required for any primary structure. It requires a 10-day public notice, an asbestos inspection, and a utility shutoff confirmation. You had none of those." A man stood up from the back of the room. It was the county inspector I'd spoken to, the one Carla had sicked on me. I'd invited him as a guest. "That is correct," the inspector said, his voice official and unimpeachable. "That was an illegal demolition. We have opened a formal investigation based on this footage." That's when Carla finally snapped. The mask of the calm professional community leader shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. "You!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. Her voice rose to a near scream. "You are the criminal. You are a terrorist, holding this entire community hostage. I built this community. I protected your investments. I gave you order." She turned on the crowd, her eyes wild. "And you people are pathetic, ungrateful. You let this old man walk all over you. This is my HOA, my rules." She swept her arm across the table, sending papers and her stupid gavel flying onto the floor. Steve, her enforcer, just sat there, looking terrified, wanting no part of the meltdown. It was spectacular. A full-blown, power-mad tantrum, and Tina was capturing every single second of it. That's when the 2 sheriff's deputies walked in. Doc had called them 10 minutes earlier, suggesting they might want to be present to prevent a breach of the peace. They stood by the door, just watching, letting her dig her own grave. Carla didn't even seem to notice them. She was in full spiral, screaming about lawsuits and liens and how she would ruin every single person in the room. Finally, one of the deputies walked calmly to the front. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat, "I think you've said enough." Carla whirled around to face him. "You can't do anything to me. Do you know who my husband is?" The deputy just sighed and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Right now, all I know is that you are a suspect in a criminal property destruction and trespass investigation." He took her arm. She tried to pull away, but it was over. As they led her out of the room, still yelling threats, a single person started clapping, then another, and another. Soon the entire room was filled with applause. I didn't join in. I just stood there, arms folded, watching quietly as the wreckage of Carla's little kingdom was finally hauled away. Tina's video wasn't a spark. It was a wildfire. It had 100,000 views before Carla even made bail. By the end of the week, news vans were parked outside the chain-link fence I'd put up. The story went national. Veteran outsmarts Ho after she illegally demolishes his cabin. Tina's shaky phone footage of Carla's meltdown became the defining image of petty tyranny getting its spectacular comeuppance. The public fallout was swift and brutal. The district attorney, facing an online firestorm, filed criminal charges for felony property destruction and fraud for the forged documents. My civil suit was a separate matter, a slow but steady grind that Doc handled with quiet efficiency. In the end, facing a mountain of undeniable evidence, Carla's insurance company settled. The judge, in a separate ruling on the civil penalties, ordered her to pay damages that covered not only the full cost of the rebuild, but also the emotional distress. It wasn't a windfall, but it was justice, cold and hard and itemized on a legal document. She and her husband sold their house a few months later and moved away, vanishing from the community she had tried so desperately to rule. The day the first check cleared, I didn't go to the bank. I went to the lumber yard. The demolition was a lonely act of destruction, but the rebuilding was a joyful, noisy resurrection. It started with just me and a set of blueprints, but then Bill the mechanic showed up with his heavy-duty power tools and a cooler of cold drinks. The next day, Sarah's husband, a carpenter by trade, came over and offered to lead the framing. Soon, a half-dozen neighbors were there every weekend. People I'd only known with a polite wave were now sweating and laughing alongside me, raising walls and setting trusses. We built the new cabin stronger than the old one, with deeper foundations and better lumber. The last thing we did was install a simple memorial bench down by the water's edge, made from a beautiful piece of cedar. We engraved a small brass plaque on it, "Mary's Place." She loved the loons. The hole they had torn in my life was being filled in, not just with wood and nails, but with the quiet strength of community. Once the cabin was finished, I had one last piece of business. I had won the war by taking control of the land, but I had no interest in being a king. Power is a tool, not a throne. I'd used it to fix a problem. Now, the problem was fixed, and it was time to put the tool away. Doc drew up the paperwork. We legally dissolved Northridge Holdings LLC, my forgotten little company that had become the key to everything. Then, in a carefully structured legal agreement, we transferred the ownership of the roads and all the common lands from my LLC to a newly formed community trust. The trust was designed with one purpose: to hold the land for the benefit of all residents, forever. We wrote ironclad protections into its charter, clauses that made it impossible for any future HOA to ever be formed or to ever claim jurisdiction again. The land belonged to the neighborhood now, truly and forever. The following month, we held the first meeting of the new Lakeside Meadows Neighborhood Council in my newly rebuilt cabin. It was voluntary. There were no dues. Bill was elected president by a unanimous vote. The feeling in that room was one of relief, a shared sense that we had taken back not just our property, but our peace of mind. A few weeks later, on a warm Saturday morning, I took Leo down to the lake. The air smelled of pine and fresh water, the way it was supposed to. We sat on the new dock, our feet dangling just above the surface. I showed him how to bait a hook, my hands steady now. We didn't talk much, just sat in the comfortable silence, watching the tip of his little fishing rod. After a while, the rod tip bobbed, then jerked down hard. His eyes went wide. He reeled and reeled, his small hands struggling with the crank, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. He pulled up a little sunfish, shimmering in the morning light, bigger than the first one he'd caught. As I helped him unhook it, I looked from the fish, to my grandson's smiling face, to the new cabin, to the memorial bench where Mary's name gleamed in the Sunday they tried to take away my peace. But I built it back stronger, not just for me, for all of us. I looked out over the calm water, a feeling of quiet satisfaction settling deep in my bones. Sometimes justice isn't found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's in a property deed and a little bit of grit.